impossible. There's so much stuff. And so I'm going to hit some highlights, all right? So pay attention to what I do get, okay? There are different types of policies. There's taxation that's called fiscal policy, right? Revenue and spending, taxing and spending, fiscal policy. There's monetary policy. That's things like interest rates and tariffs, okay? That's the structure of the banking system, okay? That's fiscal policy, okay? We also have social welfare policy. That's things like education, poverty aid, health, environmental policy, immigration policy, which we're absolutely not going to talk about because you've already read a lot about immigration and dealt with immigration policy, right? This is all domestic policy. So, taxation. I always ask this question. What are the three different types of tax? Or define them, or ask in some way a progressive tax is. Okay, I always ask this question. So progressive tax is when people who make more money get taxed at a higher rate. Okay? Federal income tax is a progressive tax. Proportional tax is when people all pay the same rate of tax. So if you make $1 million a year, or you make $20,000 a year, 5%, 10%, 20% of your income goes to taxation, right? The way that a flat tax would actually work, just so you know, fiscally, would be 15%. So that means if you make $20, you get $3,000, okay? It's more painful when you're making $20,000 than if you're making $100,000 and you give $15,000, right? In terms of what you have to spend, and we'll talk about that in a second. Regressive tax is the opposite of progressive tax, okay? In other words, more of your income is taxed, the less money you make. A good example of this is sales tax, okay? A sales tax is a regressive tax because the less money you make, the more money you have to spend on goods and services as a percentage of your income, okay? And how many of you own your house? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, okay? Which is awesome because if you get a mortgage to buy a house, you pay interest on that mortgage, right? But what happens to that interest? At tax time, what happens? You get it back. You get all of it back. Whereas if you rent, not only do you not get any sort of tax back for that, but you pay taxes on your rent. Not just property, sales. Okay? In addition to that, if you're making, let's say, $30,000 a year, how much of your money are you spending to survive? How much are you saving? Maybe a better question. Practically none, right? Maybe if you're super frugal, you save a little bit, okay? But mostly, you make it week to week, paycheck to paycheck, okay? And so all of your money is getting taxed again in sales tax, all right? If you make more money, so for example, you guys can look at my income. I make a whole $52,000 here at the University of Oklahoma, all right? Plus I teach in the summer, so it comes to about 60, okay? So $60,000 a year, and out of that, I get taxed, right? But I also get money taken out that goes directly into retirement savings. About 10% that I take out before I ever see it. So there's no taxes on it. So 10% of my income gets absolutely zero tax on it. A big chunk of my income pays my mortgage payment, which has zero tax on it, and I get money back for paying interest. Right? So that's a pretty good deal, right? At this point, we're talking about maybe 30% of my income that has no taxation on it at all. That's significant. Okay? Because that means that I have that money to accumulate wealth, which we'll talk about in just a second. An earned income tax credit is a negative income tax that provides income For poor working people, you have to work. And listen, this is important. You have to make at least $12,000 a year, and you can't make more than 20. And if you have 3 or more kids, you get a whole $6,000. I think I looked it up the other day, it was $6,853 for 3 kids or more. So if you have 4, nothing makes it. Stop at 3. Right? But again, you have to be working. You have to earn a certain amount, and you can't earn more than another amount. Okay? In the United States, these are our taxes as compared to the rest of the most developed world. And this isn't everybody listed. I just kind of put some sample countries up here. If you notice, Belgium, Germany, Sweden, between 42 and 54% of their income goes to taxes. Okay? There are more countries that fit in there above 36%, but the United States, or 36%, is the median, right? There's a lot more above that. But I have the U.S. here to demonstrate that we are well below the median. And I'm doing this for a reason. It is political season, you guys. People are running for office. And they are telling you that the United States taxes you more than anybody else in the world. And they are lying to you. Okay? They're lying. It's a flat out lie. Okay? Taxes are not that high as compared to the rest of the developed democratic world. Okay? Now, if we look at most taxpayers are going to pay 15% of their income or less in taxes. That's the bracket for most people. If you look at, these are households, incidentally. Households, not population, right? So we're looking at about 117 million households, okay, that pay 15% or less. 25% tax bracket, that's 24 million. You can add everything to it. We get up to a little over, right at 30 million, okay? So, what did I say before? How many? How many households? 116 versus 30 million households. Is that about right? Okay. The vast majority are paid 15% or less in taxes. Okay? This is how we spend our money. So we're talking about taxing and spending. That's fiscal policy, right? Fiscal policy. Manipulating the money supply, that's monetary policy, and we're not going to talk about it today. Okay? But that's interest rates. That's how much money we're producing. Okay? Tariffs, things like that. That's all monetary policy. We're talking about fiscal policy. This is how we spend our money. 28% of our budget goes to health. 25% goes to Social Security. 16% goes to defense or Homeland Security. Veterans get 4%, transportation 4%, food and agriculture 4%, and for drug and agriculture, all that's together. Education 3%, international affairs 2%, housing 1%, energy 1%, science 1%, labor 1%. Okay? So let's talk about what social welfare actually is. Okay? These are policies that provide benefits to individuals. You get, as an individual, a direct benefit from the policy. So that doesn't include things like roads. Okay? You do not get a direct benefit from the road, kind of everybody gets that benefit. However, education is a social welfare policy. Why? Why is education a social welfare policy? Yeah.
Because it's compulsory.
Because, not because it's compulsory. Not because it's compulsory.
Well, in the sense that, like, you have to attend, so you're going to receive the benefits of it. When it comes to roads, not everyone's going to use a road necessarily.
Yeah, up to a certain extent, yes. But we don't necessarily, you're not compelled to go to public schools, for example. You could go to a private school if you wanted to instead. So compulsory is not why. But
Government funded.
in part, right? But the main thing is this. of your education. You do, right? As an individual, you've got that benefit, okay? So it's an individual benefit. Poverty programs are also aimed at individuals, right? The idea is we're going to provide this individual something or this family something. Social Security, you get that Social Security check, right? You work during this period of time, you get that Social Security check. Healthcare, when you do benefit, that is an individual, obviously, you know, there's larger healthcare programs like research and development and so on. We'll talk about that in a second. But there's individualized healthcare benefits, right? Medicare, Medicaid, the Affordable Care Act, the Child Insurance Program. Okay? Is my sticky on? I feel like I'm yelling.
It's hard to hear you. It's on. It's just.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So the largest student loans, right? That's another example where that is a government social welfare program. Eric's mother was outraged at this thought because she said, hey, I took out that loan, I had to pay it back, so I didn't get any benefit. But the truth is while you're in college, who's paying the interest?
Government.
The federal government. You're not doing it. And you have a grace period, and any number of grace periods that come afterwards.
And the interest rate's lower.
And the interest, what?
And the interest rate is lower.
Well, social, we'll talk about that later. It's not always true. Sometimes, not always true. The largest social welfare policies, Social Security and Medicare, take up 45%. Okay? 45% of our budget together. Okay? 90% of Americans approve of Social Security and Medicare. These are incredibly popular programs, and they're the ones taking the biggest chunk, right? You add veterans to that, and that's half of our budget, and it's all entitlement programs. In other words, you do a thing, you get a thing, and we'll talk about that in just a second. The majority of social welfare recipients are not poor. 5 out of 6 of all money, 5/6 of all money goes to entitlement programs, not means tested programs. So what does that even mean? Okay, we'll talk about it in a second. Education is mostly an entitlement program, okay? It's a subset of legislation which provides standards for course material, it mandates days spent in school, it provides funding, it requires adequate yearly progress, and it grades districts on performance. This is K through 12 only, okay? State and federal policy control both of these things, and so we'll see really disparate outcomes according to how states are funding or structuring education in their state. Okay? The federal government is providing some money, providing some outlines, but they do not have ultimate control. I would like to give you an example in just a second of that. There are two subsets of education policy. There's higher ed policy, which if you have any questions about that, you can ask Eric, because he studies that. And then common ed policy, okay? So there have been 4 major education policies that are common ed, okay? The National Defense Education Act of 1958. Anybody know why we have an Defense Education Act in 1958? Yes? Absolutely. Because we did not want to get behind in the Cold War, right? And so we really focus on things like science and math and critical thinking, okay? This idea that we needed to be able to innovate.
What's that?
In 1965, this gets expanded. It says, you know, yes, math, science, good. Critical thinking, good. But, you know, not everybody does that. Maybe we should also language arts, social studies, give some funding and some kind of guidelines for what we do there. That's in place from 1965 till 2001. It's a really big period of time. It's certainly what I went to school under as a kid, okay? So that means that my teachers were focused on critical thinking skills, heavy on science and math, but also arts, language arts, social studies, all these things is more well-rounded. We took every year something called achievement tests, all right? These achievement tests we took every year at the end of school. They were awesome. I love them, right? I know that's your experience with testing. I'm serious though, I loved it, right? I loved it. It was great. There were multiple choice tests. I would put in the little dots. We would get them back. They would say, you're brilliant. I would say, I knew it. It was great. It was an amazing game, okay? But they didn't matter. Those achievement tests maybe said, hey, look, this person maybe needs to be in some more developmental programs, or maybe this person needs to be in some honors programs. But other than that, they didn't influence your grades. They didn't influence whether you went up to the next grade. They didn't influence funding. They were just benchmarks for individuals. With No Child Left Behind, George W. Bush had been governor of Texas. Remember we talked about how in federalism you have states as laboratories of democracy, right? And so they tried different policies, and he had been governor of Texas. And while he was governor of Texas, they had put this No Child Left Behind policy in place in Texas, and it had been wildly successful, right? You had seen a difference in test scores, in students, much higher achievement, better graduation rates, all sorts of stuff. And so he said, hey, look, I got this great program. And Democrats, you know, George W. Bush is a Republican, Democrats are like, yeah, let's do it. Republicans are like, yeah, it's a Republican program, let's do it. Bipartisanship, everybody was super happy, right? Put it into place. And what it did was it created tests that you took in the 5th grade, the 8th grade, and the 11th grade. How many of you took those tests? Quite a few of them. We kept them for a while. Those tests were meant specifically for a purpose. If students did not do well enough on those tests, then funding was pulled from their schools. If their teachers did not perform, their teachers were fired. And so what we discovered about 5 years after this goes into place as a federal program, a funding program, is that the books had been cooked in Texas. That what had happened is that these schools had said, hey, we're going to lose funding, so let's transfer a bunch of these students out, and made them transfer students, and so they weren't even counted. So graduation rates went up because students who were failing were just pushed off into the Netherlands. Because schools had to, in order to get their funding, perform. Because there wasn't anything to help them. There was no part of this program where it was like, hey, if you're having problems, then what we're going to do is we're going to invest in you. It was like, you have 1 year to do bad, but the second year, money's gone. Okay? And so people said, we're doing fine, everything's fine. Those students don't exist. Right? And so we start seeing this around the country. We're saying, hey, why isn't this working like it was working in Texas? And we start looking at it, and this is why. We have another problem. We have a pedagogical problem. What's pedagogical mean? Pedagogical? Teaching. What? Oh, wait, you have a hand? Where's the hand? So, Dennis said there was a hand somewhere. Pedagogical. Teaching, right? You know, it's a teaching issue, right? The way that people learn and teach, right? So we have a pedagogical issue because teachers in the 5th grade, 8th grade, and 11th grade started doing what? Teaching to the test. And so students memorized everything they could, which means they lost 3 years of learning and critical thinking, and instead, memorization only. And then we see it expand, so there's 4th grade too, and it's 7th grade too, and it's 10th grade too, to make sure that they're able to do it. And that critical thinking leaves our schools.
That's not literate.
In 1997, whenever I was much younger than I am now, I went to Kyrgyzstan to teach at the American University of Kyrgyzstan and helped them form an American-style law school. And I had students in my class that were 16, 17 years old that were college freshmen who were amazing in many ways, right? But one of them had gone to a school that was patterned in the Soviet style, and they memorized for the exam. And it wasn't just multiple choice. I mean, they could write essays in this memorization form, right? And the other one was a school that was based on critical thinking. It was more of what was considered a Western-style school, okay? I had both of these students in my classes. And my 16 and 17-year-old college freshmen, who I was teaching about international treaties and the impact of them on international law and the negotiations and how they were determined, because I was straight out of law school, so it was very legal and technical, were amazing. They wrote these, I would give them these examples, and I would say, hey, you know, this thing could happen, so what would you do? What laws would you apply? How would you argue? And in a class like this, they would sit down and they would write me these essays that were amazing. The other half of my class looked at these questions where I asked critical thinking questions, and they could not answer them. But I got some still amazing answers, because one of my questions, for example, I made up a country called Brasiliania. Sounds a lot like Brazil, and this student thought so too. And she wrote, Brazil is a lush green country whose major imports are this and major exports are this. The major critical issues going on in Brazil today. I mean, and she sat down, I didn't give her the questions before the exam, and gave me a 3-page essay on Brazil. Because she had memorized that at some point. This is what we're talking about problems in terms of pedagogy. She was clearly a very bright student, but she didn't have the ability to apply principles. She didn't have the ability to critically think and make arguments. So we see a lot of that with No Child Left Behind. In 2015, everybody's really angry about No Child Left Behind. And we passed something else, the Every Student Succeeds Act. You guys were the beneficiaries of much of this act, right? But the idea was simply this. States had to put forth a set of benchmarks that they would follow. This is the standards we're going to use. This is the curriculum we're going to do. And they handed that to the federal government. The federal government said, okay, and they gave them money. Easy peasy, right? Something that was very popular and something that was approved by the state of Oklahoma during this time was a curriculum program called, any guesses? Common Core. Okay, Common Core. Parents freaked out about Common Core. Why?
Wasn't it because it was a federal standard?
But it wasn't a federal standard, so though the state of Oklahoma tried to pretend it was, but that's not the case, yeah.
A little too generalized?
Not too generalized. Mainly they freaked out because they couldn't do the math. Okay? Because students were being taught a different way of doing math, right? A different way of looking at it to try to help people do it. And that's not how parents knew how to do it. And they couldn't do the math. And so they freaked out because they couldn't do 3rd grade math. And they started lobbying the state of Oklahoma. And the state of Oklahoma said, yeah, this is terrible, let's get rid of it. And the legislature got rid of it. But the legislature didn't put anything else in its place. And very clearly, the federal money coming in, which pays for 1/3 of our schools in Oklahoma.
Well, and it should be noted the scorecards for the K-12 schools were coming out at the same time. The scorecards, the A through F report cards.
Oh, yes. And so the report cards coming out, they were also not
Mad
great.
about that.
They're not great. But the federal government says, hey, look, you guys, all you had to do was have a curriculum. you don't have one, so no money for you. And a third of the funding for Oklahoma schools disappeared. The governor at the time, Mary Fallon, says, oh, the federal government interfering with our schools, telling us to do things. So remember, don't just listen to what politicians say, office holders say. Know something about it, okay? Because all the legislature had to do was say, we're going to replace Common Core with something else. The thing we had before, whatever. And it was done, it was over. It was their mistake. And so there had to be a special session called so that they approved something for schools to do instead of it just being willy-nilly. But one of the big problems that we continue to see is this reliance on testing because it's a good benchmark that people can quantify, and so it's easy. But we no longer tie funding to it. And so teaching to the test is terrifically unhelpful. Okay? But we still do it. As I told you, the most popular programs are entitlement programs. Social Security is an entitlement program. It was created during the Great Depression because during the Great Depression, the elderly were the poorest because they couldn't work. And so basically, they were being left alone to starve to death. Whereas 5-year-olds could go out and scrap for food in the streets. I'm totally serious here. I'm not in any way using hyperbole. Okay? So the poorest were the elderly who couldn't move and were starving to death where they were. So Social Security was created to help the elderly, right? You worked, you put in your money, you retired, and the government provided a safety net. In other words, enough that you didn't die. That's what it's supposed to be. Something to make sure you don't die of starvation, right? We added Medicare in 1965 to make sure people could also get their medication and didn't die. And employers and employees both contribute to the Social Security Trust Fund. So when you pay in your percentage, your employer has to pay in an equal percentage, okay? Because they don't have pensions for you anymore, okay? They used to have pensions, or they would put away stuff for you. They don't do that. Some do. Get a job that does. Ask those questions. Or 401k. It's okay. It's not as good. The trust fund, right? This was all contributed to the Social Security Trust Fund. But the trust fund is used to pay benefits and to loan money to the government. Okay? A lot of the national debt comes because we have taken money from the Social Security Trust Fund and loaned it to ourselves. We first started doing this in the 1960s, late 1960s. Why did we do that? What were we paying for?
Vietnam.
Vietnam. That's right. We paid for Vietnam with old age insurance. Right? The ratio of, and so now the way it goes is this. We are working, and the money that we're making that's going into Social Security is being directly taken out and pay beneficiaries right now. And the ratio of workers to beneficiaries is narrowing. Because of who? Who can we blame for it?
Old people.
Come on, you guys, you can do it. Baby boomers, of course. You can almost blame everything on baby boomers. Go ahead, it's fine, okay? It's a baby boomer's fault. I'm not a baby boomer. I'm not hurt by this. I'm Gen X, right? So, I mean, my generations basically thought they were horrible from the beginning. So, baby boomers are responsible for this, okay? Because there's so many of them. There's so many of them. And so the trust fund will soon be in the red unless it is paid back. We could pay it back. We could replenish it. There was that option in 2000 because we had some surplus, right? That was what Al Gore ran on. George W. Bush ran on everybody gets a check for $200. George W. Bush won narrowly on that issue. So, the difference between entitlement programs and means-tested programs, basically, if you did a thing, you know, you worked to put in money, and you're this age, you get this, right? Or, how many of you are veterans? Two? Only two. Two veterans, okay? What are some things that you get because you are a veteran? Your GI Bill, education, entitlement program. You get it because you were a veteran, okay? What else? Disability, all right? My husband has 10% disability because he broke both of his knees jumping out of a helicopter at some point, right? And so he gets $150 whole a month. It's only 10%.
Yeah, it's a steak dinner.
Good. That's right. It pays a credit card bill once a month, okay? It's all right. It's not nothing. But what else do you get? You have a house. How'd you get that house?
Oh, so you get a VA loan of up to $400,000, but you can get that while you're active. It's like you don't have to wait till you're another.
That's right.
But then I have to be 100% disabled, so I get free property tax, like tax free.
That's right. Also free property tax, right? So free property tax if you're disabled, right? And it doesn't have to be 100%. I think it has to be 50% in order to get free property tax. Maybe
It's
60.
100 now.
Oh, did they change it to 100? So free property tax, that's a pretty good deal, right? Add that to the fact that you can get a loan without a down payment at the lowest possible interest rates, which is awesome. My husband, as a veteran, we definitely took advantage of that, right? And so my income, my interest rate on my home loan is really low, like super low, like shockingly low, okay? My mother is applying for a loan and they're talking about 5-6%. And I'm like, that's insane. Who would pay that? Everybody else. It's an entitlement because the government is going to ensure that you don't default. Means tested programs. Government programs that are only available to individuals below a poverty line. And each policy has a different poverty line. So, for example, children and families below a certain income level, okay? Did I take attendance?
No, you got me too.
I'll do it right now. I had it open and then I didn't do it. Attendance is live. Attendance is live. Attendance is live. Okay. So, children in a family below a certain income level can get medical insurance, okay? And that poverty line is higher. Like parents may make as much as $25,000, $30,000 and their children would still apply. But the parents do not, at that level, qualify for insurance. They have to be below $15,000, $14,000 a year. And so there are different poverty lines for different programs, okay? These means tested programs. There's also housing programs, HUD, but again, your income has to be below a certain level, all different poverty lines. Means tested programs get 15% of the total budget. 45% of the total budget goes to entitlements. That's huge because we hate means tested programs. And there's a reason for that. In the 1960s, LBJ created this war on poverty. He talked about the Great Society. He was concerned about people of color who were living in poverty. He was concerned about rural America that was living in poverty. And he creates this war on poverty that includes things like Medicaid. It includes things like aid for families with dependent children, AFDC. And he wants to fight poverty. He thinks government programs, training, stimulus money, can actually do something about the poverty problem. In the 1980s, there is a pushback against this under the Reagan administration. The media is super helpful with this. They put forth myths, like the welfare queen myth, right? Not real. But everyone is led to believe that the vast majority of people on welfare are cheating the system. Not the case. Talk a little bit more about that in a second. Let's talk about what money is. So there's income, that's what you make each year, right? You guys can look up my income if you want. It's on Open Secrets, Oklahoma, whatever. I make $52,000 a year, plus I teach in the summer, so I make about 60 from the state of Oklahoma, right? That's how much money I make. That's my income in a year. But that's not my wealth. Okay? Wealth are the things that I have accumulated during that period of time or over time, right? Maybe things that I got from my parents, right? It made a difference that my parents had the money to give me certain things. But it's also things like the fact that I had some money to invest, right? Some of that money went into a 401k. That extra. Wealth is different. My CD collection, I'm sure that's going to come back. I have like 400 of them, something like 20 bucks. They're very worthwhile. One of the keys to a successful democratic process is a large middle class. This is from de Tocqueville. This is part of democratic theory. Why? Why does a large middle class matter for democracy to work? What is special about the middle class?
I mean, they drive the culture, but they're also like the largest proportion of the spenders.
Largest proportion of the spenders, and what did you say before that?
They kind of drive the culture.
Drive culture, okay. Back here, I saw a hand. Did you have something? You're just stretching? Yep.
Or the backbone of the economy.
Backbone of the economy, pay more in taxes than anybody else, right? Big part of it, spend more money. Yep.
I've actually heard that like they're not so low income that they're like for super redistribution, that they're not so high income that they're
They suck the money from the government.
That's a big part of it, right? They also are more likely to give to charity. They're less likely to hoard wealth, okay? They're more likely to turn their money around. But here's part of it that's really important. People who are middle class are often broke, right? I mean, they have some money, and they'll get more money in a little bit, but they understand what it is to be broke, right? For example, right now, I am broke, right? It's, we get paid on Wednesday. Try not to use all my gas till then. So I have some understanding of what that is. We're very clearly...
You get paid twice a month?
This is my husband's salary. Right? But the point is that I know what it's like, right? I have some understanding of economic hardship, but at the same time, I also have enough money to maybe put money toward causes I care about, or I have more time because I'm more likely to be salaried as opposed to hourly, so I can volunteer for things. For example, I am going to be a precinct worker because it's on Tuesdays and I don't normally teach on Tuesdays. And even if I did, I could probably let my class go for a day, right? That's something I can do because I'm middle class. I know enough to say, hey, this is important, right? In terms of money. But at the same time, I also, have this equal idea, right? Too much distribution is too much, right? There's a kind of idea, right? I want to hold on to what I have, but not as in the same way that I'm not for people getting more, right? I understand that. So when we talk about income inequality, one of the big concerns that we have is that we need to invest in the future. That's education, job training, scientific research, infrastructure. It can spur economic growth. Because Eisenhower built the highway system in the 50s, our economy grew rapidly. Okay? It creates jobs and it also uplifts the working poor. But this takes a lot of money. So let's think about poverty for a second. Bill Gates owns as much as 40% of the country. He's not even the richest, right? But this is the one that always gets me, all right? 50, and I always ask this on the exam, okay? 50.4% of all working Americans, okay? People who work, drop below the poverty line for a year or more in their life. 50%, a little bit more, drop below the poverty line for more than a year for the latter. Only 10% of means-tested recipients use it for more than 5 years in a lifetime. This is ADRC looking at their own records in the early 1990s. But 13.9% of Americans live below the 2018, this is 2018 poverty line. Low income and poor are 43.5% of the population. These are working Americans. Only 20% of those below the poverty line, right, are going to receive assistance. This is our poverty rate from 1959 to 2015. Look at the war on poverty in the early 1960s and the difference it makes. But we have some racist attitudes about poverty. One, we do think, and we have some conflicting attitudes too. One, we think, hey, government should help. That's a thing government should do, right? Government should help. But also we think people who are poor should work harder. Because I work hard, right? People should take personal responsibility for themselves. The whites' attitudes are strongly influenced by their view of non-whites. The media, that welfare queen I was talking to you about, portrays 3/4 of all welfare recipients as African American. When in fact, about 1/5 of recipients. The vast majority of people who receive welfare benefits are white because they're the vast majority of the population. But if we look at this, non-Hispanic whites, in terms of poverty rate, they're at the bottom there. They do best. 9% as opposed to 24%, 21%. Asian Americans, 11%. In 2019, pre-COVID, because frankly, I'll need a year before I can put this together again, okay? Native Americans, more than 1/4 live in poverty. Latinos, 22%. African Americans, 21.6%. Asian Americans, 14.7%. Non-Hispanic whites, 9.9%. But here's the key. And I want to talk to you for just a second about education policy. 51% of K through 12 children live below the poverty line. Do you want to know the single federal policy that increases achievement among elementary and secondary students? Any guesses? Yeah?
Subsidized lunch
And breakfast.
and breakfast.
But it's not subsidized,
Free.
it's subsidized across the board. If you provide free breakfast and lunch for everybody at the school, then there's no stigma of poverty, and test scores go dramatically up. Because children are living in poverty and are malnourished. And if you don't have protein, you can't think. If you want something to power your brain, I know sugar is a really nice thing, don't get me wrong, I love it too. But an egg would get you a lot farther. Okay? And protein is what's making the difference. We have opposing views on poverty. One way to look at it is there's a culture of poverty, this idea that people live in poverty and it reinforces itself, and there's this lack of connection to family, poor work habits, lack positive aspirations, lack self-control. Sounds more like college students to me. Whereas hostile environments are the other way. Look, we have racial discrimination that is structural, social and cultural customs, right? Women in particular are going to be a victim of this, and educational limits. The primary link, again, is to disparity in income is unequal access to quality education. That's a primary link that we can find. Unequal access to quality education. And so this position is that poor are poor because of external barriers to their success. More work does not mean less poverty. The United States has more people in the workforce. Right now we have unemployment levels at the lowest they've ever been. Ever. Okay? work longer hours, and has more poverty than every other industrialized country. Unemployment insurance is an entitlement. You give and you get back. U.S. workers work more than France or Germany or Italy or the UK. And there's the OECD average, 51 hours a week. 30% of our total budget goes to health. That includes veterans, subsidies under ACA, the CDC, FDA, USDA, children, Medicaid, Medicare. Pandemics, etc. We haven't had one in 100 years, but this one was a doozy. Because of CDC guidelines for what we should do, we confronted it in this way. That's subsidized by the federal government. But last year, we got $2,100 per taxpayer and $3,000 per dependent child. Here, by the way, are the rates. Just as a note, just so you know, it's the end of the semester. And in New York, Omicron variants are spiking, and that is adding to hospitalizations, more hospitalizations. Don't get sick at the end of the semester. Be smart, all right? This is a gift to you from...
Commence primary ignition.